The rain came down sideways that night, the kind of rain that turned headlights into smeared halos and made the shoulder of Route 9 disappear into a black, shining nothing, and that was where Catherine Hayes stood, ankle-deep in a puddle that hadn't existed 20 minutes earlier, staring at a flat front tire on a car that cost more than most people's yearly salary, and was, in that moment, utterly useless to her. Her phone had 4% battery left and no signal. Her heels were ruined. Her umbrella had flipped inside out somewhere around mile marker 6, and she had simply let it go, watched it cartwheel off into the dark like something she didn't have the energy to chase anymore. And now she stood with her arms wrapped around herself, blinking rain out of her eyes, watching car after car slow down, just enough to see a woman alone on the shoulder and then speed back up. Because nobody stops for a stranger anymore, not really, not at 10 at night in a storm like this. Then one car did slow, a gray 10-year-old sedan with a crack in the windshield, indicator blinking, easing onto the gravel behind her. And when the door opened and a man stepped out into the downpour, without even reaching for a jacket first, Catherine felt something in her chest go very still. Because she knew that walk. She knew that quiet, unhurried way of moving through a crisis like it was just another Tuesday. And when the porch light of a passing truck lit his face for half a second, she realized she was looking at Adam Walker, the man she had fired, personally, 11 days before Thanksgiving, with barely 5 sentences and no eye contact. In the back seat, a small voice broke the sound of the rain hitting the windshield. "Daddy?" Bella asked, soft and certain in the way that only children manage to be. "Aren't you going to help her?" To find out how a man who had every reason to keep driving ended up kneeling in the mud beside the woman who ended his career, and what it cost both of them to become a family instead of enemies. Stay with this story until the very end. And if you've ever believed that some people are simply born to walk past you, and some people are simply born to stop, tell us in the comments which kind of person you've been on your worst night, because so many of you watching have lived one side of this moment or the other. There's a version of this story where loyalty to the company that built your career should have meant something, and a version where the company never once remembered who actually kept its machines running long after the ribbon cuttings and the press releases were forgotten. And you'll have to decide for yourself, before this story ends, which version you believe. 6 weeks earlier, none of this had seemed even remotely possible. Adam Walker had spent 11 years as senior quality and reliability technician at Harlow Precision Manufacturing, a mid-sized industrial parts supplier just outside Columbus that made the kind of components nobody thinks about: bearings, seals, calibrated fittings, until the day they fail and an entire assembly line goes dark. He was the kind of employee who never got mentioned in the company newsletter, never took credit in meetings, and never needed to, because everyone on the floor knew that if a machine was making a sound it shouldn't be making, Adam would hear it before the sensors did. He had a logbook, handwritten, that went back 9 years, cataloging failure patterns most engineers half his age had never been taught to notice. He didn't talk about it. He didn't need to. 2 years before the story truly begins, Adam's wife Maria had died after a short, brutal illness that took 11 months of hospital rooms and hope, and finally didn't take mercy on either of them, leaving Adam alone with an 6-year-old daughter, Bella, and a version of grief that didn't announce itself loudly so much as sit quietly behind everything he did, every single day, like a low hum under the floor. He had stopped applying for promotions. He had stopped staying late. He drove Bella to school every morning at 7:40, and he was in the pickup line every afternoon at 3:15, and somewhere in between, he did his job better than almost anyone in the building, because focusing on bolts and tolerances and vibration patterns was, for those 8 hours, the only thing quiet enough to hold his mind together. At the top of Harlow Precision sat Catherine Hayes, 44 years old, the company's CEO for the last 3 years, having taken over after her father's sudden retirement and inherited both his company and a mountain of expectations she had never asked for. Catherine ran on 4 hours of sleep and 11-hour days, because Harlow was 11 weeks from finalizing a $220 million supply contract with a national automotive client, a contract that would either secure the company's next decade or, if it collapsed, take 412 jobs down with it. She was sharp, exacting, and had built a reputation for never once flinching in front of a board member. But underneath the composure was a woman terrified that she would be the Hayes who lost what her father built. The man standing closest to her, professionally, was Operations Director Marcus Reyes. Polished, quotable, always the first to speak in a meeting and the last to admit fault in one. Marcus had spent 4 years cultivating the image of the man who kept Harlow's floor running on time and under budget. And he had done it, in no small part, by quietly taking credit for fixes that men like Adam had actually diagnosed. Adam had never fought him on it. It hadn't seemed worth the energy, not with Bella's bedtime routine waiting for him at home, not with grief still living behind his ribs. He told himself, more than once, that being right quietly was enough. It would not stay enough for much longer. 3 weeks before the automotive contract's final inspection, Adam noticed something in the readings off Line 4's primary press. A harmonic vibration, barely a whisper above baseline. The kind of anomaly that 99 technicians out of 100 would have logged and forgotten. Adam wasn't the 100th technician. He wrote it up in detail, flagged it as a level 2 risk, and walked the report personally to Marcus Reyes's office. Because Marcus, not Adam, held the authority to schedule an unplanned shutdown for inspection. Marcus read exactly the first paragraph in front of him, told Adam that Line 4 had just passed its scheduled maintenance 3 weeks prior, and that shutting it down 48 hours before an investor walkthrough would look like panic, and set the report down on top of a stack of other papers that Adam would never see again. Adam went home that night, put Bella to bed, read her half of a chapter about a brave dog finding its way home, and told himself he had done what he could. 12 days later, at 6:52 in the morning, before the day shift even fully arrived, the primary press on Line 4 seized and failed catastrophically, sending a cascade of downstream damage through 2 additional systems, halting production for 6 days, and putting the entire $220 million contract on the edge of collapse 3 weeks before its final deadline. Catherine Hayes stood on that floor at 7 a.m. that morning in a blazer she'd thrown on over pajama pants, looking at 6-figure wreckage and a board meeting in 4 hours, and she needed, more than anything else in that instant, a name. 6 weeks would pass before the sound of rain on a windshield would matter to either of them more than any number on any contract ever had. But first, someone had to be blamed, and it would not, in the end, be the man who had actually tried to stop it. Marcus Reyes stood in the wreckage of Line 4 beside Catherine that same morning, and when she turned to him and asked, flatly, whose desk this landed on, he didn't hesitate. He said Adam Walker had signed off on the last routine inspection. He said Adam had access to the sensor logs and hadn't flagged the pattern in time. He said it in the calm, reasonable cadence of a man who had rehearsed being calm and reasonable his entire career, and he never once mentioned the report sitting, unread past its first paragraph, in a folder on his own desk. Catherine didn't have time to dig. That was the truth of it, and it would come to haunt her later. Not that she was cruel, but that she was drowning, and drowning people grab whatever is closest to hand. She had a board call in 4 hours and an automotive client's inspection team flying in that same week, and she needed to walk into both conversations with an answer, a name, a decision already made, because uncertainty at the top of a company in crisis reads as weakness, and weakness was the one thing her father's company could not survive right now. She called Adam into her office at 9:40 that morning. He came in still smelling faintly of the machine floor, hands raw from 6 hours of triage work, and stood in front of her desk without sitting down, because some part of him already knew. She told him, in 5 sentences, that his position was being terminated effective immediately, that his access badge would be deactivated by end of day, and that HR would process his final pay within 2 weeks. She did not ask him a single question. She did not ask him what he had seen, what he had flagged, what he had tried to prevent, because in her mind the story had already been written for her by someone she trusted, and Adam Walker did not correct her. He could have. Later, this would be the detail that undid her most completely, that he simply nodded, said he understood, and asked only whether his final check would still include the unused vacation days he'd need for Bella's winter break, because he'd already promised his daughter a trip to see her grandmother, and he wasn't about to let a company be the reason he broke a promise to an 8-year-old who had already lost too much. Catherine watched him leave her office that morning and felt, for a fraction of a second. Something close to unease. The particular quiet of a man who wasn't fighting for himself, not because he had nothing to fight with, but because he had decided, somewhere along the way, that the fight wasn't worth what it would cost him at home. She didn't examine that feeling. She had a board call in 90 minutes. Adam cleared his locker in 11 minutes. He left his handwritten logbook behind, in a drawer, because it belonged to the floor and not to him, and because some quiet part of him hoped somebody, someday, might actually open it and read what was inside. Nobody stopped him on his way out. A few technicians looked away, the particular kind of looking away that people do when they suspect an injustice, but aren't sure it's their place to say so out loud. He drove to Bella's school and sat in the pickup line 40 minutes early, engine off, hands on the wheel, and when she climbed into the back seat and asked why he was there so soon, he told her he'd finished work early and that they should get ice cream on the way home, even though it was 38 degrees outside, because some days call for ice cream regardless of the weather. She didn't ask any more questions. She was 8. She trusted him completely, and that trust, more than any severance package, was the thing Adam had actually been protecting for 2 years. The version of stability Maria would have wanted for their daughter, unbroken by whatever storms moved through her father's professional life. If he had a version of himself that still fought for recognition, that version had quietly died somewhere in a hospital hallway 11 months before Maria did, and he had made peace with the trade. That night, after Bella was asleep, Adam sat at the kitchen table with a beer he didn't finish and did the math on a whiteboard he kept for grocery lists, severance, savings, the mortgage. 6 weeks of runway before he'd need something, anything, even if it paid less and demanded less of him than 11 years at Harlow ever had. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried in front of anyone since the funeral, and he wasn't about to start over a job. He simply erased the numbers, wiped the board clean, and went to check on his daughter. Because in the only ledger that had ever really mattered to him, she was the only line item left. If you've ever been the one who was blamed for someone else's mistake, quietly, without ever being given the chance to explain yourself, if you've ever swallowed the unfairness of it because you had someone at home who needed you steady more than you needed to be right, tell us about it below, because this comment section has become a place where so many of you have found each other in exactly that feeling. There is an old argument that never really goes away in workplaces like Harlow. The question of whether the newer generation, with its confidence and its credentials and its comfort in a boardroom, should really be trusted over the quiet people who spent a decade learning a machine's every sound by heart, long before anyone gave them a title that matched what they actually knew. Marcus Reyes had the title, Adam Walker had the knowledge, and for 6 more weeks, only one of those 2 things would matter to the people signing the checks. A month would pass, ordinary in every visible way, before an evening errand in a rainstorm forced 2 lives back into the same 6 feet of gravel shoulder, and neither Adam nor Catherine would walk away from that night the same person they'd been walking into it. Catherine Hayes did not think about Adam Walker again for 11 days. She was too busy holding together an automotive contract that had, against her own expectations, survived the Line 4 disaster mostly intact thanks to 6 days of triage work done by a rebuilt team, 3 of Adam's former colleagues, and a very expensive rush shipment of replacement parts. The board was satisfied. Marcus Reyes gave a confident presentation crediting the recovery to a, quote, complete review of accountability structures, and Catherine, exhausted and relieved, let the matter close. It reopened on a Tuesday afternoon, almost by accident, when Priya Nasser, a young data analyst in Harlow's reliability department, was pulling 6 months of maintenance logs to build a routine year-end report and noticed something that didn't sit right. A report filed under Adam Walker's name, timestamped 12 days before the Line 4 failure, flagged as Level 2 risk and never once acknowledged, escalated, or closed out in the system. Priya wasn't looking for a scandal. She was looking for a clean spreadsheet. What she found instead sat wrong in her stomach for 2 full days before she finally forwarded it, hesitantly, to Catherine's assistant, with a short note asking whether this had been reviewed already, because if it hadn't, someone probably should look at it before year-end. Catherine read the report alone in her office, after 7 that evening, when the floor below her had gone quiet, and she read it twice, and the second time through she felt something cold settle into her chest, because the language in that report was precise, calm, and unmistakably correct. Adam Walker had identified the exact failure pattern that took down line 4, 3 weeks before it happened, and had walked it directly to Marcus Reyes's desk. She didn't sleep well that night. She kept circling back to the 5 sentences she had used to end a man's 11-year career, and the fact that she had never once asked him a single question before doing it. The following morning, she called Marcus into her office and asked him, directly, whether he remembered receiving this report. He said he remembered a report, vaguely, and that in hindsight he wished he'd escalated it, but that at the time it had seemed like routine caution rather than a genuine warning, and that hindsight always made these things look clearer than they had actually been in the moment. It was smooth, it was reasonable. It was, Catherine realized with a slow, sinking discomfort, exactly the kind of answer a man gives when he is choosing his words to survive a conversation rather than to tell the truth inside it. She didn't confront him further that day. She needed more than a memory versus a memory. She needed the paper trail, and Priya, quietly and thoroughly, over the next 9 days, built her one. Email timestamps, internal routing logs, the original unedited file with metadata showing exactly when it had been opened, and for how long, and by whom. It took Catherine 3 sleepless nights of reviewing it alone before she was certain enough to act. And even then, she wasn't entirely sure what she intended to do with the certainty once she had it. It was in the middle of that same unsettled week that Catherine's car broke down on Route 9 in the storm, on her way home from an emergency dinner meeting with the automotive client's regional director. A meeting that had gone sideways when he'd casually mentioned a competing supplier and made clear the contract survival was once again not guaranteed. She had been distracted, replaying that conversation, when her tire blew, and it was Adam Walker who pulled over. He didn't say much at first. He got the spare from her trunk while Bella held an umbrella over him that did almost nothing against the sideways rain, and he worked in near silence, methodical, unhurried, the way he did everything. And it was only once the new tire was on and Catherine stood there soaked and stunned and unable to fully process what was happening that she managed to say his name out loud, like a question. He told her to get home safe. That was almost all he said. He didn't mention the firing. He didn't ask for anything. He got back in his car with his daughter and drove away. And Catherine stood on that shoulder in the rain for a long moment before she could make herself move, because the man she had ended a career for, without ever hearing his side of it, had just kneeled in mud and cold water to fix her car and then left without asking for a single thing in return. She showed up at his apartment 3 days later, unannounced, having gotten his address from HR under the thin pretense of processing paperwork. She offered him his job back, at a higher salary, with an apology and a title that would have made the last 11 years finally look, on paper, like what they'd actually been. Adam listened to all of it standing in his own doorway, Bella's cartoons playing faintly behind him, and when Catherine finished, he told her quietly that he didn't want the job back. He said what he wanted was for her to actually read what Marcus had buried, and to make sure the next person who tried to raise a warning inside that building wouldn't have their name erased for it the way his had been. He said this without raising his voice, without a trace of triumph, and then he thanked her for coming and closed the door gently, and Catherine stood on his front step for a long moment, holding an apology he hadn't fully accepted and a truth she now had to decide what to do with. 2 weeks later, an anonymous letter reached 3 members of Harlow's board, laying out, in far less careful language than Adam's original report, the outline of a cover-up, and suddenly Catherine's quiet, private reckoning became a crisis with witnesses. The letter did not name Marcus Reyes outright, but it didn't need to. It described the buried report, the timestamp discrepancy, and the 6-day production halt with enough specificity that 3 board members demanded an internal review within the week. And Catherine, who had spent the last 2 weeks quietly gathering exactly this evidence on her own, suddenly found herself needing to decide whether to control the narrative herself or watch it get torn apart in a room she didn't run. She chose to control it. She called an internal review meeting, official, with Marcus Reyes, 2 board members, Priya Nasser, and, after a private phone call the night before, in which she told him plainly that she needed him there, and that this time she would ask him every question she should have asked 11 weeks earlier. Adam Walker. He came. He wore the same quiet, unremarkable clothes he'd worn for 11 years on that floor, and he sat at the far end of the table with the manner of a man who had nothing left to prove, and therefore, nothing left to be afraid of. What happened in that room took 40 minutes, and it happened almost entirely because Adam refused to perform outrage even once. When Marcus tried, early on, to characterize the buried report as a routine miscommunication, Adam simply asked whether Marcus remembered the specific harmonic frequency listed on page 2 of that report, and when Marcus hesitated, Adam recited it from memory, along with the tolerance threshold it had exceeded, along with the exact model number of the bearing assembly involved, along with the maintenance cycle line 4 had been on for the previous 4 years, a level of precise, unglamorous, undeniable technical fluency that no amount of boardroom polish could counterfeit. And that made painfully clear to everyone in that room exactly which of the two men had actually understood what was happening on that floor. Priya presented the metadata next. The exact minute Marcus had opened the file, the exact minute he'd closed it. 11 seconds later, well before reaching the paragraph describing the recommended shutdown. The room went very still. One of the board members, a woman named Eleanor Voss, who had sat on Harlow's board for 19 years and rarely spoke in meetings, asked Marcus directly whether he understood that his decision, not Adam Walker's oversight, was the reason 412 jobs had nearly been lost. Marcus's composure, so carefully built over 4 years, did not survive that question. He tried for a moment to redirect blame back toward the maintenance schedule itself, toward Adam's original wording, toward anything that wasn't a straight admission, and it was in watching him do this, watching a man who had built his entire career on sounding reasonable finally run out of reasonable things to say, that Catherine felt the last of her own denial give way completely. She had trusted the wrong voice in that room 11 weeks earlier, not because she was careless by nature, but because Marcus's confidence had been louder than Adam's quiet, and she had let volume stand in for truth. She ended the meeting by placing Marcus Reyes on immediate administrative leave pending a full external audit, a decision that would, within the month, cost Harlow its operations director entirely and would cost Catherine something else. The automotive client's regional director, informed of the internal scandal as a matter of contractual disclosure, would use it as leverage to renegotiate terms downward by nearly $11 million rather than walk away outright. A wound to Harlow's bottom line that Catherine would have to explain to her board personally, and that she chose to explain honestly rather than obscure, because she had just spent a month learning exactly what it cost other people, when the people in charge chose comfortable stories over hard truths. Adam said almost nothing throughout the aftermath. He drove home that evening, picked Bella up from her after-school program, and made spaghetti, because Tuesday was spaghetti night, and some routines, he had learned the hard way, mattered more than any boardroom vindication ever could. But something had shifted in him too, quietly, in a way he wasn't ready to name yet even to himself. The first loosening, in nearly 2 years, of a grip he'd kept clenched around every part of his life that Maria's absence had left unguarded. He caught himself, later that same week, laughing at something Bella said at the dinner table, a real laugh. Unguarded, the kind he hadn't managed in longer than he could easily count, and he sat with that surprise for a long moment before he let himself simply enjoy it. Catherine, meanwhile, sat alone in her office 2 nights later, with the audit findings in front of her, and made a decision that had nothing to do with the board, nothing to do with optics, and everything to do with a man who had knelt in the rain to fix her tire without asking for a single thing in return. She picked up her phone and asked Adam whether she could bring Bella's favorite, kind of hot chocolate, by the apartment on Saturday. Not as an executive making amends, but as someone who wanted, plainly and a little nervously, to be let back into his life as something other than the woman who had once ended his career. 8 weeks would pass, quiet and unhurried in the way real healing usually is, before either of them was ready to call what was growing between them by its true name. The public reckoning happened 3 weeks after that internal review, at Harlow's quarterly all-staff meeting, the one gathering every year where every technician, every line worker, Every office employee stood together in the same warehouse-sized room to hear the company's leadership summarize where things stood. Catherine had planned initially to let the Marcus Reyes matter fade quietly into an internal HR footnote, the safer corporate instinct, the one that protects a company's image at the cost of the truth. She changed her mind 2 days before the meeting, sitting across the table from Adam over coffee, when he told her, not as a demand, simply as an honest answer to a question she'd asked him, that the people on that floor deserved to know the truth about why Line 4 had failed, because half of them had spent 6 days doing brutal, unpaid overtime triage work believing it had been someone's careless mistake, when it had actually been someone's careful, deliberate silence. So Catherine stood in front of 400 employees that morning and told them plainly what had happened. That a Level 2 risk report had been buried, that the man blamed for it had actually tried to prevent it, that she herself had made the decision to end his employment without asking him a single question first, and that she was, in front of all of them, both correcting that decision and apologizing for it. She didn't dress it up. She didn't soften her own role in it. The room went very quiet, and then, somewhere near the back, someone started clapping, and it spread, not thunderous, but steady. The particular sound of 400 people recognizing a wrong, finally being named out loud. She offered Adam, publicly, his old role back with a new title, Director of Reliability Engineering, full authority to shut down any line on his own signature, no approval chain standing between his judgment and the machines he understood better than anyone in the building. Adam stood, thanked her, and then, in front of the entire room, declined the title. What he asked for instead was smaller on paper and larger in every way that mattered. A formal, protected channel by which any technician on that floor could file a safety concern directly to the board, bypassing management entirely, with legal protection against retaliation, so that no one else would ever again have their warning quietly closed in 11 seconds by someone more interested in optics than in the truth. Catherine agreed on the spot, and the Harlow Direct Line, as it came to be called, was in place within the month. He did accept a role, quietly, weeks later, once the noise of the announcement had died down. Not director of anything, just senior technician again. The same floor, the same machines. The same quiet hours that had let him hold himself and his daughter together for 2 years, except now with a logbook that people actually read. The quiet coda came 4 months after that, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in early spring, in Adam's small backyard, where Bella was teaching Catherine, clumsily, patiently, with the fierce seriousness only an 8-year-old can bring to instruction, how to fly a kite that kept nosediving into the grass. Adam stood on the porch step watching them, a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and when Catherine finally got the kite to catch a real gust of wind and hold it, Bella's whoop of triumph carried clear across the yard, and Catherine turned back toward the porch, laughing, hair coming loose from its usual careful arrangement, looking less like a CEO than she had looked in 3 years. Later, after Bella had gone inside to draw a picture of the kite for her father's refrigerator, Catherine sat beside Adam on the porch step and asked him quietly whether he'd ever really forgiven her. He thought about it for a while before answering, the way he thought about everything, and told her that forgiveness wasn't really the word for what had happened between them. It was closer to watching someone choose, slowly and at real cost to herself, to become someone worth trusting, and that he'd found it was easier to build something new with a person than to keep waiting for an old wound to fully close on its own. On the refrigerator that evening hung Bella's drawing, a stick figure kite, tangled once, held steady now, 3 figures standing beneath it instead of 2. There is a version of being overlooked that most of us carry quietly, without ever saying it out loud. The version where somebody decided who we were before they ever really asked. Where our worth got measured by a title or a moment of bad luck instead of by the quiet, steady work we did every single day when nobody was watching. Adam Walker never once raised his voice to prove what he knew. He simply kept being exactly who he was, kneeling in the rain for a stranger who had wronged him, teaching his daughter that kindness doesn't wait for an apology first. And it was that quiet consistency, not a single dramatic confrontation, that finally let the truth catch up to him. Has someone in your own life ever been dismissed or misjudged the way Adam was, quietly written off before anyone bothered to actually see what they carried, what they knew, or what they'd already survived? Tell us, Bub. that person in the comments below, even if it's only to finally give them, publicly, the credit you always believed they deserved. And if you believe that the quiet, overlooked people in your own life are usually the ones actually holding everything together, consider staying part of this channel's family by subscribing, because we'll keep telling their stories, one quiet, overlooked life at a time. Stay with us. There are more stories like Adam and Catherine still to come, and the truth in each one is worth staying until the very end to find.